What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? I just wanted to hop on here and take you through the dissection of the prompt again and then planning out potentially what you might write about for Monday's LEQ. So just to recap a couple things that I talked about in class, I'll kind of just go over it again real quick. So this was the prompt that you guys received: develop an argument that evaluates the extent to which such movements or transfers led to demographic, cultural, or social changes across the Atlantic region. Remember, that was coming from this little description here, which is giving you the time period, and it mentions the connections between world regions, and then that led to movement or transfers between these regions of people, animals, plants, and pathogens. So a couple things that we need to consider. I mentioned this in class, but the period, wanting to make sure we are aware of what time period we're referring to. Obviously, we just learned about this, so it's pretty straightforward, but if you got this prompt after learning a whole course, you'd want to focus in and use that period to kind of give you some clues of what they're talking about. In addition to the period, we know what we're being asked to do, which is evaluate change over time / continuity. You might be asked to do that. You might be asked to do cause and effect or compare and contrast. In this case, it's change over time, specifically resulting from the movement or transfers. And then they also give you the region. The Atlantic region, which comprises West Europe, West Africa, the Americas, basically any state that is involved in trade, any society that's involved in trade across the Atlantic Ocean. So it's very important that we are aware of this period, what we're doing in the region, because we're going to use that later on when we get to crafting our thesis. So as I said, when it says evaluate the extent, that's just simply asking you, how much change is occurring? Is it a lot? Is it a little? Somewhere in between? And then demographic, the points of change that we're referring to. So what categories are we looking at when we're measuring the change? Demographic would be population, so the size and the makeup. Makeup meaning like the ethnicities within the population, gender within the population, cultural, your customs, traditions, and religion. And social, your hierarchies, your class systems. So think about, imagine those social pyramids. How much are they changing? And so here, just to give you a visual, what we're dealing with, this is all the Atlantic region. This is basically just showing you an overview of the Columbian exchange, some of the goods, animals, and diseases that were spread through it. So now we got to ask, in this region, how much change was taking place? So what I would do before I even write my thesis, like if I just got this prompt, let's say I didn't know it ahead of time and I just saw it before me, like on, say, the AP test, I would brainstorm what I know about the changes in each of those categories. So I'll look at demographic, cultural, and social, and if I just hop in here, I'd start writing down, like, okay, what do I know? All right, population, so maybe I'll write something like native population declines in Americas. Then maybe I'll think, all right, cultural, I remember something about like forced to convert to Christianity in Americas. Focus on native, cultural. Maybe I'm thinking like, all right, in Western Europe, they started drinking tea and they started chocolate. I remember that photo from that lesson where they're having hot chocolate. Is that significant though? Then I can already start to see, like, is that really a big change? It's a change, but is it as significant of a change as like the conversion to Christianity, literally changing your whole religion in the Americas? Social, I remember like in encomienda system. What the heck is happening here? Encomienda system with new hierarchy. I remember them saying something like being race-based, depending on where you're born and what blood you have, it would determine what place you were on the social ladder. All of this stuff is stuff that you just had to know and learn. A lot of it was contained within those sources when we did the lesson on Columbian exchange. But either way, after I start brainstorming, I'm going to start asking myself, which categories do I know the best? Because the prompt says or, so you don't have to do all three. You could technically do one as long as you still include two pieces of evidence. But this is where I can ask myself and decide what I want to focus on. Like if I feel really good about Native American population decline, I'm probably going to have that involved in my thesis in some way. So I'd brainstorm a little bit more, see what I can think of, and then decide on what I'm going to do. So let's come back here. All right, now we want to brainstorm the thesis. So in the thesis, we need our claim and a line of reasoning. It has to be historically defendable. So you can have a claim, you can have reason, but if it isn't actually provable with historical events or developments, it's invalid, and you're not going to get credit for it. So starting with the claim, we've been doing this throughout the year, but just a couple things to note when you get a prompt like this is you should basically just copy and paste the prompt and just add your stance. So for instance, here, I still have movement and transfers led to, what I'm adding is the word significant. It led to significant, and then I'm picking demographic and cultural change. And then I just copy and paste Atlantic region, that was straight from the prompt, and the period 1450 to 1750, that was straight from the description before the prompt. This would be a solid claim. It takes a stance on it, it evaluates it. This would not be a solid claim. If you just say movement and transfers led to change in the Atlantic region, this stinks because you're not actually evaluating it. You're just saying it led to change. How much change? Tell me. You gotta add that key word like significant, somewhat, dramatic, mild, minimum. And then your line of reasoning, this is where you gotta match it up with your claim. So if I said demographic and cultural change, I'm expecting to see a demographic and a cultural reason to support the idea of significant change. So here I take my claim and I just add, because of the dramatic decline in Native American populations, that's demographic, and the forced conversion to Christianity, that would be cultural change on the Spanish missions in the New World. Green is my claim, blue is my reasoning, that would get you credit. One thing I'll note though is that part of the rubric does ask for complexity, which is the hardest point to achieve. A thesis like this would get you credit for the thesis point, but it might limit you later on in getting complexity. So for complexity, you do want to add like a counterpoint to your thesis. So this is to say like, all right, I'm saying in that initial thesis that there was significant change, but I could make it a little bit more nuanced, which means it's not as black and white if I acknowledge that the change wasn't as significant in every single region within the Atlantic region. So what I mean by that is like, I might acknowledge one region had more change than another region. Or, and another way you could do it is maybe acknowledge that the social changes were more significant than the demographic, or vice versa. It's tough to do, you really got to know your stuff to do this, but if you want and you're shooting for that full complexity point, that's just what you're going to have to do. So I could say, take my initial thesis and then add a little complexity by making it more nuanced. So now I'm going to say, I'm going to add this counterpoint. While the cultural and demographic makeup of Western Europe, specifically identifying that region, largely remained the same because of the dramatic decline and forced conversions, the cultural and demographic makeup of the Americas, pointing that out, dramatically changed due to the movement and transfers in the Atlantic region during the period 1450 to 1750. Therefore, and this is kind of my final claim here, therefore the degree of change varied depending on the region. Just reading that, you can tell like that's definitely more complex than what we've seen here. Alright, so as far as actually writing the essay now, once we do have our thesis that has a claim, has a line of reasoning, the introduction is always the same. 3 to 4 sentences of context, so explaining what developments led up to the topic of your prompt, in this case the Columbian exchange. So what sort of factors were at play leading up to that. We did that in class the other day, so you can honestly kind of just use what you wrote there and what we discussed at the start of class then. Body paragraphs, what I would do is either break it up by region, if my thesis deals with 2 different regions, or break it up by categories, if it deals with 2 different categories. If you don't have more than one category, you could just break it up by like the evidence that you're going to include. So you need 2 pieces of evidence, so maybe one paragraph deals with one piece of evidence and the other one deals with the other. But I would definitely focus on trying to do it regionally or categorically. So the structure is pretty much always the same. You need a topic sentence where you just introduce the point that you're going to make within that paragraph. Give a little more context, like explain the causes, in this case, of the change. Input your evidence, so prove the change with or use evidence that can prove the change. Connect it back to the thesis, that is where you prove the change, and then add some analysis. Let's do a little practice, because it's one thing for me to tell you this, but if you can actually see it, it'll make a little bit more sense. So let's say I take that first thesis, the one that wasn't that complex but still was quality and still met the mark. I made note that there was a significant demographic and cultural change, and my reasoning was because of the decline in Native American populations and the forced conversions to Christianity. So my first body paragraph, I'll just take that demographic Native American population decline, that demographic point. So I'll have a topic sentence. It might say something like this: one of the most significant areas of change that resulted from the movement and transfers across the Atlantic during the Columbian Exchange was the demographics of the New World. My point there, demographics, it's going to be significant change. So I'll give a little background, explaining why there was change. Here I just talk about the arrival of Europeans, the forced labor, the spread of disease. Now I got to give evidence. So then I'll enter in. For example, historians estimate the population of Native Americans declined by around 90% within the first century of European colonization. Now, your evidence, it doesn't need a specific statistic. In this case, it really helps to have that, because it definitely highlights the severity of that change. But technically, you just need a specific historical development or event. Like, for instance, Columbus's voyages, that would be a specific event. But if you just said, exploration over the Atlantic, it wouldn't really be as specific. And so I enter this in. Now I need to connect it back to the thesis. So I might say, this demonstrates significant demographic change. That was the whole point. The change is significant because it completely decimated states and communities to near extinction. Just showing how, prior to the arrival, they had states and communities. Now they're nearly extinct. Add a little bit further analysis. I'll say something like, in the case of change, talk about what it was like before, and then really center in with how dramatically different it is now after the change. So cities that used to thrive were completely abandoned, many groups forced to resettle on the countryside. This dramatic decline, here's my little historical thinking here, eventually is going to pave the way for European colonial domination over the remainder of the period. That's where you kind of add your historical insight within your argument. And so if I was continuing to write this, I would do another paragraph on the forced conversions and the cultural change. If I continued with it, I probably wouldn't earn complexity. It depend if I acknowledge anything later on, but I would say just the thesis isn't really setting it up for complexity. But you would still probably have a solid essay by the end of it that would earn all points except for the complexity point. So that's that. If you have any questions, just reach out. But I hope this helps a little bit. Have a good rest of your weekend.